He only needed her signature. That was how Harriet found out her marriage was over. Not with a conversation, not with an apology, not even with the decency of eye contact. Just a manila envelope slid across the kitchen counter. While she was still in her robe, coffee in hand, believing, in that particular fragile way people believe things they shouldn't, that the worst was behind them. Legal. Drew it up last week, Elliot said. He was already in his suit, already somewhere else in his head. I need you to sign before Friday. Harriet set down her coffee. She looked at the envelope. She looked at her husband, this man she had followed to Chicago, left her job in Portland for, spent 11 years building a life around, and she thought, he's already gone. He's been gone for a long time, and I just didn't know where he went. She signed on Friday. She didn't cry until she was in the parking garage of her attorney's office, alone in her car with the engine off. And then she cried the way you cry when no one is watching. Ugly, airless, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Not because she was surprised, because she had known. She had known for months, maybe longer, and had kept choosing not to know, which is its own kind of grief when it finally catches up to you. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting in that parking garage, was that she was already 6 weeks pregnant. Elliot Harmon had come from money the way some people come from small towns. It shaped everything about him without his ever having to acknowledge it. His family owned Harmon Capital, a private equity firm with offices in Chicago, New York, and London. He had joined at 26, made partner at 31, and married Harriet Voss at 33. A fact the firm's publicist had noted approvingly, because Elliot had a tendency toward choices that looked impulsive from the outside, and Harriet was the kind of woman who made him look considered. She had been a contracts attorney then, sharp, precise, the kind of person who read every line of everything. She'd been the one who caught a 7-figure discrepancy in a merger document that 3 senior partners had signed off on. Elliot had called her the best legal mind I've ever seen who doesn't have an ego about it, which was the closest he ever came to a compliment that wasn't also about himself. She quit her job 2 years into the marriage, not because he asked her to. He hadn't, exactly, but because the hours were brutal, his travel schedule was relentless, and someone had to be the one who actually kept a life running. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself a lot of things. By the time the marriage ended, she hadn't practiced law in 4 years. The woman Elliot had been seeing was named Brooke, 29. Worked in communications at a firm across town. Harriet had found out the way you usually find out. A text that came through on his unlocked phone while he was in the shower, casual in that way that meant it wasn't new. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He looked, if anything, slightly relieved. It's been a long time coming, Harriet, as if she should have been better prepared. The divorce was handled efficiently. Elliot had a team of attorneys. She had one, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who specialized in high-asset dissolution, and had a way of looking at Harriet across her desk, like she'd seen this exact situation before, and had opinions she was too professional to voice. The settlement was fair. Patricia made sure of that. But the house went to Harriet in lieu of other assets. A house she couldn't afford the property taxes on alone, in a neighborhood that had been chosen for Elliot's commute, not hers. She signed the papers on a Tuesday in March, and the following Thursday she threw up in the bathroom of a Walgreens and stood for a very long time staring at the 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test she'd bought mostly to rule it out. She sat down on the closed toilet lid. She thought about the timing. She thought about the fact that she and Elliot had, improbably, spent a weekend together in January that had been almost tender. One of those strange islands of warmth that appear in dying marriages without explanation, that you later understand were the last of something rather than the beginning. She called Patricia. The papers are already filed, Patricia said after a pause. There's a standard clause. Any children born within the marriage window are presumed. I know what the clause says, Harriet said. I wrote enough of those clauses. I'm asking what my options are. Your options, Patricia said carefully. Air your options. But you should know that if you disclose the pregnancy before finalization, his attorneys will move to renegotiate everything. The settlement, the asset division, custody terms. It will extend the process by months, minimum, and Elliot will have legal claim as the presumed father. Harriet looked at the wall of the Walgreens bathroom. Someone had scratched something into the paint above the paper towel dispenser. She couldn't make out what it said. "And if I don't disclose?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "The papers finalize in 6 weeks. That's a decision only you can make." She didn't disclose. It wasn't a decision she made all at once. It was a decision she made incrementally, the way most consequential decisions actually get made. One day at a time, each day telling herself she'd decide tomorrow, until tomorrow became finalization day and the question answered itself by default. She told her sister Robin, who drove up from Indianapolis and sat on Harriet's kitchen floor with her and ate Thai food, and said, "You are going to be okay," with the conviction of someone who wasn't certain but needed to say it anyways. Harriet put the house on the market in April. She found an apartment in Lincoln Square. 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, a window in the kitchen that got good morning light. And she began, in the quiet, methodical way that had always been her default mode in crisis, to rebuild a structure around herself. She called an old colleague from her firm days, a man named Stephen, who had since started his own boutique practice, and she asked if there was any part-time consulting work available while she figured out her next step. He said yes without hesitating, and she understood he was doing her a kindness, but she also knew she was good enough that it wasn't only a kindness. She worked from home, mostly. She took long walks along the river in the evenings when the nausea receded. She read everything she could find about single motherhood, about navigating the legal complexities of parental rights, about what her actual obligations were and weren't. Old instincts coming back. Her brain, shaking off years of disuse, starting to move the way it used to. She was 4 months along when she met Callum Reed. It happened the way things happen when you are not trying. Badly timed, inconveniently located. Nothing like the version in your head. She was at a small gathering at Stephen's house. She'd forced herself to attend because her therapist had pointed out, gently but repeatedly, that she was becoming a person who only left the apartment for OB appointments and grocery runs. Callum was there because he was Stephen's client, or former client. The story was slightly unclear. He was tall, quiet in the way that reads as confidence rather than shyness, with the kind of face that looked like it had been through something and come out on the other side better organized. He was introduced to her as the founder of Reedlux Group, which she didn't recognize, and which turned out to be a hospitality and real estate development company with properties in 7 cities. He noticed she was pregnant before he said anything else, and he didn't make it strange the way people sometimes do. No performance of not noticing, no overcorrection toward cheerfulness. He just said, "How far along?" And when she said 4 months, he nodded like that was useful information and moved on. They talked for most of the evening, about the city, about her work, which she described vaguely and he didn't press, about a building he was developing in the West Loop that he thought the neighborhood zoning board was going to fight him on, and she'd said, almost without thinking, "Have you looked at the 2019 variance precedent on Fulton?" There were 3 successful appeals that year that might give you a framework, and he'd gone still in a particular way and said, "I have not." "Who are you, actually?" She had laughed. It had surprised her, the sound of it, how much she'd needed it. He asked for her number before the evening ended. She gave it to him and then walked home in the mild April dark, thinking about how strange it was that she had just done that. How strange, and, underneath the strangeness, how much like herself it had felt. He called 2 days later. They had coffee, then dinner, then another dinner. She told him about the pregnancy earlier than she'd planned, because it seemed dishonest not to, and because she was, at her core, a person who preferred the hard thing said clearly to the comfortable thing left vague. She told him she was recently divorced, that the child was her ex-husband's, that Elliot did not know, and that she had made a considered decision not to tell him, and that she understood entirely if this was more complication than anyone would reasonably sign up for. Callum was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not going anywhere. I want you to know that." She didn't believe him, the way you don't quite believe something good when you've recently been educated on how quickly good things rearrange themselves, but she let herself hear it. That was something. He was patient in a way she hadn't expected. He didn't push. He showed up, literally, sometimes, with food, when she'd mentioned offhandedly that the second trimester fatigue had made cooking feel insurmountable. He came to one of her ultrasound appointments because she'd mentioned it in passing, and he'd asked quietly if he could come. She'd said yes before she'd fully processed the question. "Twins," the technician said, and the word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Harriet turned her head. Callum was looking at the screen. His expression was very still. "Twins," she said, to no one in particular. "Two," the technician confirmed, with the patient cheerfulness of someone who delivered this news regularly. "Both measuring right on track. Do you want to know the sex?" She looked at Callum. He looked at her. Something passed between them that she didn't have a name for yet. "Yes," she said. "Two girls." The call from Elliot came in July, when she was 6 months pregnant and had just signed a consulting contract with a downtown firm that Stephen had brokered, the kind of contract that meant she was, officially, back. She didn't pick up. He left a voicemail, clipped, businesslike, the tone she'd come to think of as his operating mode, saying he'd heard through someone that she was pregnant, that he needed to speak with her, that there were legal questions that required her attention. She listened to the voicemail 3 times. Then she called Patricia. "He can't have heard from anyone official," Patricia said. "The finalization went through. There's no record connecting him." "Someone who knows someone," Harriet said. "Chicago is smaller than it looks." Patricia's voice shifted into the register it took on when she was thinking fast. "Do you want to hear from me what your legal exposure is here, or do you want to hear it from someone who isn't on your side?" "I want to hear it from you." The presumption clause expired at finalization. Because the pregnancy wasn't disclosed and the papers are filed, he would have to prove paternity through court-ordered testing, then petition to establish parental rights, then argue that establishment of those rights is in the children's best interest. He'd also have to explain to a judge why he's pursuing this now, given that he made no inquiry during the marriage, no inquiry during the divorce, and only became aware through indirect channels after the fact. So it's possible. It would be a process, and courts in Illinois do consider a child's established circumstances when he's going to try, Harriet said. She wasn't asking. "Yes," Patricia said. "I think he is." The girls were born on a Tuesday in September, 6 days before their due date, in a birth that was fast and overwhelming and ended with Harriet holding 2 very small, very indignant human beings who looked, she thought, more like each other than like anyone else. They were pink and squashed and impossibly real. She named them Agnes and Pearl. Callum was in the waiting room. He had driven her to the hospital at 3 in the morning and stayed the entire time, and when the nurse brought him in afterward, he stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the two of them for a very long time without speaking. "Hi," he finally said to Agnes, who was asleep, and then softer to Pearl. "Hi." Harriet watched him. She thought about the parking garage in March, the steering wheel, the emptiness of that moment. She thought about how thoroughly the landscape had changed in 6 months, and how none of it was what she'd expected, and how much better it was than what she'd been afraid of. Elliot filed for paternity establishment in October. Harriet found out on a Friday morning, via a certified letter that arrived while she was feeding. Pearl and Agnes was making the sound she made when she wanted to be put down immediately. She read the letter standing up, Pearl in one arm, and felt something cold move through her chest. He was claiming presumed paternity under the marriage window. He was requesting court-ordered DNA testing. He was citing, in the language of someone who had paid a lot of money for that language, his interest in maintaining a parental relationship with any children of the marriage. She called Patricia. "We expected this," Patricia said. "I know we expected it. I need to know what we do. We can test. We establish the timeline of your separation, the circumstances of the divorce, the fact that there was no marital cohabitation from. When did you actually stop living together?" "November. Last November, and the pregnancy dates from January, yes." "So there's a window," Patricia said. "Small, but there. His attorneys will argue that the January weekend. I know what they'll argue." Harriet shifted Pearl to her other shoulder. "What do we argue?" What they argued was this: that Elliot had been in a relationship with another woman for the entirety of the period in question, that the marriage had been functionally dissolved long before the paperwork confirmed it, that he had shown no interest in having children during the marriage, had in fact, according to documentation, Harriet had located and provided to Patricia, undergone a procedure without her knowledge in the second year of their marriage that was specifically intended to prevent conception. A procedure he had never mentioned. A procedure she had discovered in a medical record she wasn't supposed to have found, buried in a filing cabinet he'd brought from his office when they'd briefly shared workspace during a renovation, that she had opened by accident and then, once opened, had read. She had never told him she knew. She had never been sure what to do with it. It had sat in the back of her marriage like something poisonous she'd walled off and refused to examine. Now she examined it. Patricia submitted the documentation in November. The effect on the other side was not immediate, but Harriet could feel it through the formal language of the subsequent filings. A recalibration, a shift in posture. Something had changed in the room. Callum met the girls properly when they were 3 weeks old. He'd been respectful of the initial whirlwind in a way that she appreciated. Present, but not intrusive, there when she called. Absent when she needed to be absorbed in the particular consuming reality of new infants. When he came to the apartment that first evening and she handed him Agnes, he held her with the careful, deliberate steadiness of someone who was trying very hard to do it right. "She's so small," he said. "She's actually the bigger one." He looked at her. "This is the bigger one?" Agnes chose that moment to open her eyes and stare at him with the profound, unimpressed gaze that newborns have, as if they've been everywhere and found it all roughly equivalent. Callum laughed. The sound filled the apartment, and Pearl, who was asleep in the bassinet, stirred briefly at the warmth of it. He was, Harriet found herself thinking, genuinely good, not performing goodness, not managing an impression, just actually good, in the quiet, sustainable way that you only discover about a person over time, through repeated ordinary moments, which are the only real test anyway. She still didn't let herself think too far ahead. She was a person who'd learned the hard way that too much certainty in the wrong direction was its own form of carelessness. But she let herself be present. She let herself want things. She was learning, slowly, how to do that again. The hearing was scheduled for February. In January, 2 things happened. The first was that Harriet's consulting work led to a conversation with the managing partner at a firm she'd admired since her early career. A moment that began as a referral from Stephen and ended with a job offer, full-time, senior associate level, in the contracts division where she'd once been told, by a partner who'd since retired, that she had the best eye for exposure in this city. She accepted. The second thing was that Callum was deposed. Elliot's attorneys had discovered Callum. Of course they had. That too was just a matter of time, and had moved to include him in the proceedings as a potential interested party. The implication was not subtle. They wanted to paint Harriet's relationship with Callum as something that had begun earlier, as something that complicated the story she was telling about a marriage that had been effectively over before the January weekend. Callum's deposition lasted 3 hours. Harriet wasn't there, but he called her afterward, and his voice was measured in the way she'd come to recognize as him being careful with himself. "They asked me a lot of questions about when we met," he said. "What did you tell them? The truth?" "April. Stephen's dinner. I told them the exact date, and I told them what we talked about, and I told them that you were 4 months pregnant when I met you, which would have made the conception in November or December, which is before November, so January," she said. "The conception date is January, right? So I told them that, and I told them I had no reason to misrepresent it, and then their attorney asked me if I was in love with you." Harriet was very still. "What did you say?" "I said that was not a relevant line of inquiry," she exhaled. "And then I said yes," he added, "because I was under oath and I don't lie under oath." She pressed her hand against the kitchen wall. Outside, the February dark was coming in fast. In the next room, Agnes and Pearl were making the small cycling sounds of infants in shallow sleep, that particular sound she had come to organize her entire nervous system around. "Callum, you don't have to say anything," he said. "I just wanted to tell you what happened." She stood there for a moment, holding the phone, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." She told him about the procedure, about the filing cabinet, the medical record, the years she had spent knowing and not knowing what to do with knowing. She told him the way she would have told anyone she trusted absolutely, not performing composure, not editing for effect, just telling him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, He tried to keep you from ever having children, Callum said, and then filed to claim the ones you had. Yes. That's. He stopped. Started again. I'm sorry. That happened to you. She hadn't expected the apology. Not because it wasn't warranted, but because she hadn't thought to want it. She sat down at the kitchen table, and the refrigerator hummed. And somewhere outside a car passed, and she thought about how much of her adult life she had spent being careful, and how carefully chosen her carefulness had been, and how much of it she was, right now, ready to put down. The February hearing lasted 2 days. Patricia presented the medical documentation. She presented the timeline. She presented the deposition transcripts, including Callum's. And she presented, with the kind of quiet surgical precision that made Harriet remember why she'd trusted her from the first meeting. A series of text message records showing Elliot's communications with Brooke during the period in question. Records that had been produced in discovery and that painted a picture of a man who had been emotionally, practically, and physically elsewhere throughout the entire window he was now claiming paternity interest in. Elliot's attorney was good. She had to give him that. He pushed on the January weekend. He pushed on the gap in documentation. He made arguments that were not unreasonable technically about the presumption clause and the bounds of marital continuity. Elliot himself sat at the table looking like a man who had not fully anticipated the shape of what he'd walked into. He had expected, Harriet thought, a softer version of her. He had expected the woman who had handed over her legal career and her autonomy and her sense of her own capability, who had spent 4 years dimming herself down to make the background more comfortable for him. He had not factored in that she had spent the last 11 months rebuilding every layer of herself that she'd given away. The judge reserved decision. It came 3 weeks later, in a written ruling that Patricia read aloud over the phone while Harriet sat in the kitchen with Agnes on her lap and Pearl asleep in the next room. The court found insufficient grounds to establish paternity under the contested circumstances. The documentation regarding the medical procedure was material. The established timeline of the marital separation was material. The totality of the circumstances, the ruling noted, does not support a finding that is in the best interest of the minor children. The petition was denied. Patricia said something after. Harriet wasn't sure what. She sat for a moment in the kitchen light, Agnes watching her face with the attentive seriousness that she brought to most situations, and she thought, it's over. Not all of it. Nothing was all over. There would still be work, and long nights, and the ongoing complicated business of being a person with children and a career and a past that didn't always stay neatly in the past. But this specific thing, this weight she had been carrying since March of last year, since a parking garage and a steering wheel, and the particular sound of herself, crying in a way she'd hoped she'd never have to again. This was done. She pressed her cheek against the top of Agnes's head. Agnes permitted this. Callum came over that evening with food. He did this. Showed up with food when the situation was large, and she had stopped finding it surprising and started finding it one of the specific things she loved about him. They sat at the kitchen table while the girls slept, and they ate, and she told him about the ruling, and he listened in the focused way he had, and when she was done he said, "What do you want to do tonight?" "Nothing," she said. "I want to do absolutely nothing." "I can do nothing," he said. So they did nothing. They sat in her kitchen in the evening quiet, the sound of the girls on the monitor, the remains of dinner on the table, and she thought about the ways your life can reassemble itself when you stop trying to hold it in the shape it used to be. She had a job she was good at. She had 2 daughters who were, at 5 months old, already distinctly themselves. Agnes serious and watchful, Pearl loud and entirely committed to her own agenda. She had Callum, who had said, "I don't lie under oath," and meant it in every direction at once. She looked at him across the table. "I'm glad I went to that dinner," she said. He looked back at her. "Stephen owes me a very nice thank you note." She laughed, and the kitchen held it, and the night outside was cold and still and entirely bearable, and she thought, this is what after looks like. Not perfect. Not the version she would have written for herself back when she still thought she got to write it, but real and hers, and better than she'd been afraid of, which is, when you think about it, more than enough. It is, in fact, everything.